Hey folks, I'm here with Ryan again. So Ryan just sat for AUD most recently and he got his score back. So just to give you a little background on Ryan's CPA journey, he started off reg with a blazing score of 99. He then transitioned to FAR and he got a 94. And then most recently he got his AUD score back and he got a 93. Now Ryan, he hasn't spent 10 years of his life auditing. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that most candidates face with audit is how to understand the conceptual nature of audit without ever, performing an audit. So Ryan, if you want to kick it off, just explain, how did you approach audit?
Right. So obviously the biggest thing, it was in my audit class. I only had one audit class. So definitely very inexperienced with this whole world. But that, and then also thinking of the how you set it up. It's about the audit process. So you have to put yourself in and think, okay, I'm setting up the audit, doing all the way from the brainstorming meeting, forming the audit team, all the way to reporting on conclusions. And so when you think about it in that whole framework, not memorizing the steps, but just thinking about it, okay, if I was really an auditor, what would I be doing here? I think that's helpful. Along with that, something that I think you've shared before, Matt, is you have to question yourself, how would I explain this concept to my partner, my audit partner? If I was actually on an audit staff, how would I describe this subjective thing up to the par of an audit partner? And I think if you have that critical thinking behind it, then you're golden.
Yeah, I was actually, I've always preached that, but then I was listening to more of a technical podcast on ways that you can better teach yourself. And that was one of the things they said is, if you go through, just ask yourself questions, because when you ask yourself a question, you're thinking about, how would I respond to this? And then when you respond out loud, even, is the best way to do it, right? It's easy to think in your brain, okay, here's how I would explain it. But when you actually have to put it into words, much like we have to do when we make the explanation videos, well, then you quickly realize if you can't formulate a sentence on something that you think you know, then you probably don't know it, right? So, going through, did you find the explanation videos for audit to be helpful? I mean, our view has always been, if you can have some extra context other than reading, this text that otherwise can be very hard to interpret, if you hear somebody like myself or my partner explaining what this truly means in sort of basic English, then that allows you to then, formulate your own opinion or conclusion on a topic.
Right. Well, and shout out to you, Matt, given your experience out there in the real world with PwC. I think what is it, eight years out there. So so definitely you brought in different explanation videos and the MCQs and so on about, okay, well, if out there in the real world, this is kind of what you face. And so that was definitely helpful to get a context for what really happens. And going off of what you said, I mean, this test is so subjective. In fact, it was kind of surprising. I won't go into what was actually on the test content wise, but there were definitely things that would never be found in an audit textbook. I mean, just there's no way you could have prepared for them. Just trying to memorize your way through. It was just totally a very interesting question set, and being able to go through and saying, "Wow, I have the tools kind of to approach this question because I see the audit process and I know the key areas." So helping critically think through was definitely powerful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to think about it. And it's great that you were able to do that, on the onset, and then looking back, realizing how important that really was. I mean, that's really what the AICPA is trying to assess. If you can put yourself in this situation, how would you respond? Because there is so much professional judgment when it comes to an audit. Yes, in some of the reporting, there's specific language, but every audit partner has to flex their professional judgment. And the point is that if you take an audit and you put 10 different audit partners on it, they're all going to do it differently, right? And that's where the subjectivity comes into play of audit. And yes, I always talk about how there's a lot of questions that will say most likely or best answer, and that's subjective. But the reality is you have to take an objective approach, because there's either going to be a right answer or a wrong answer. So if you can put your shoes and say, okay, as a professional, here's what I think would be the best. Well, you do have to simulate what it's like to be an auditor, and simply memorizing or trying to, remember the text isn't going to get the job done.
Right, right. And luckily as well, the nice thing is, of course, you're in MCQs or even in the Sims, they're not going to just for odd, they're not going to have a free response. So
Right,
there will
right.
be context cues, and then you can say, well, do your thinking, look at the question set, and then pick the best
Yeah.
answer out of all of
Yeah,
them.
that I always say that in audit, you have to read all the options because there's going to be something that will stand out and something that would, if you have a pretty good understanding, that won't make sense, right? So it's almost a process of elimination, not quite, but it's very different than tackling, say, a quantitative question where it's like,
Yeah,
okay, here's the number, which you probably
yeah,
found in BEC. There's a lot of numbers, but
right.
again, still very helpful to understand the conceptual and big picture of this whole thing.
Yeah, and just exactly, it felt weird to put the calculator down and never open it up on and and just the way it approached. So for FAR, I would usually read the last sentence and then read the whole question
Hmm.
because the last sentence is going to be asking you about the question, like
Right, right,
what
right.
number you're calculating or whatever. But for odd, you have to start from the top, read, and then make sure you're really thinking through each one because there's probably two clearly wrong ones, but
Yep.
two that are, you know, and then you have to pick the best out of
Awesome.
the
Yeah.
batch.
So, any sort of tips for audit for anybody that's taking it now, either starting fresh or will be sitting here shortly?
Yeah, if you're like me and you have no idea what you're doing, you're a tax person or whatever,
Yeah.
then just make sure you're really leaning into the materials that Universal's providing, which is just golden because they have the experience and they provide the context, and taking your time through the videos, explaining it as you
Yeah.
go, and
Plus
then
the visual
even
learning. Let's
visual
let's
learning.
put this
Yes.
into what it maybe looks like. So
Yeah.
I would ask you, what you're going to do to prepare for BEC, your last exam, but you've already sat for it.
Yeah.
For anybody that is trying to determine, Ryan he needs to get a 96 on his last exam to hit that 95.5% average to get the Elijah Watt cell. So we'll be pulling for him. We'll do one final update, a recap on, hopefully he passes. Hopefully he gets that 96, and then see where Ryan's going in his career and any lasting feedback or advice he has for future candidates. So again, Ryan, thanks for taking the time, and I know everybody out there is going to appreciate hearing your little story about audit and some tips and advice.
Great. Thanks, Matt.